Thank you for coming out on Easter Sunday to this beautiful bookshop. I'm going to talk about translating Tintin in 4 different comic strips, and we're going to take a lot of twists and turns as we get there. Starting with getting outside the Tintin universe before we get into it. So, a little audience participation. On site, who can name that palace, where that's located? Sarah. Or Nizar. Agrabah. Does everyone know Agrabah? No? You don't know Agrabah? You've never been? So Agrabah is out of Disney's Aladdin, the Gulf War classic, 91. And it really is, for me, a real great example of what it means for Western media to create fictionalized Arab cities. This is something I really focus on a lot. I call it invented geographies. So for those that do know Agrabah or can remember Aladdin, what are some qualities of the people of Agrabah? Nizar again.
Where they cut off your ears if they don't like your face. It's barbaric, but hey,
it's home. Anyone else? What's the climate?
Desert.
Dry.
Desert. Hot. What?
Dry.
Orange.
I remember that.
What happens to, Nizar got it, but when Aladdin steals, is it what's the justice system like? Yeah. Yeah. Barbaric?
Scimitar-based.
What about the women of Agrabah? Are they veiled?
Yes.
Yeah. Are they hidden?
But wearing crop tops.
Exactly. So there's magic carpet rides. There's lands of, it's just this kind of quintessential idea of what in the American justification Arab country is like. It's not real. You can't find Agrabah on the map if you pull out Google. The reason I bring up Agrabah is this is the only Trump photo. In his first term, there was a poll that was run, and they put, would you support to members of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party bombing Agrabah, which is the fictional city from Aladdin.
Oh my God.
30% of people said, yeah, we should bomb the hell out of them. So it's funny, right? But it shows you how we get constructed, how Arabs get constructed in Western media. And you can easily go from infantilizing La La Land, past kind of desert-y vibes, to we should blow them up. They both infantilize us, but they're also afraid of us. And that is kind of, when you think about these invented geographies and the way that Western ideas in Western comics and art show these invented geographies, it's how they invent us that I'm really curious about. And who am I? This is me from 2010. I was a fresh, newly minted Tintinologist. I've always been interested in Tintin. Growing up in Beirut, I remember getting copies of my friends, and we'd read them after school. And I just loved escaping into this world. And the art style, for those that are really familiar with it, we'll look at a lot of Tintin today, is clear line, all weighted. It's really graphically appealing. So I bamboozled this foundation into giving me money to be a Tintinologist for a year, and I traveled to the places where Tintin went in the comics, and that was my real business card that I would hand out to people. Yeah, and it was the best job I'll ever have. Being an attorney is not as good as that, but what I was really looking at there is my hypothesis was that I'm really curious at how Tintin gets translated into these countries where he travels in the comics. Because, as we'll get into, the representations of these other cultures are really one-sided and problematic. So what happens when those cultures have to re-receive those Western ideas in those Arab marketplaces? And it's part of a larger body of work that I put the question under, and it's how do you draw an Arab? I'm not a literal person. This is probably the most literal question I'll ever ask, and it's something I ask sincerely. I love to think about how people draw Arabs and what comes to their mind. Is it like a tarbouche? Is it like a mustache? Is it a normal person? What skin color are they? how do you conceive this? And this is from a comic that we'll get into in a little bit, Samir, where you could see that there's a lot of different ways you can conceive an Arab. And what I'll argue in this talk is that Tintin, my friend up here on the top right, tries to become Arab in a lot of the times he's been translated into Arabic language. It's not the idea of Tintin as the boy reporter from Belgium, but it really is this idea of there's an Arab guy who looks like that. And his name we'll look at is a couple different things over the time. So the question is one that has guided my research, and it's led me to like very literal examinations of the history of Arab comics. When I say the history of Arab comics, these have been around for as long as we've had comic books in the Western world or in Japan, but we don't really know about them. They're kind of these buried treasures, so to use Aladdin speak. But so my research really kicked off when I was in Cairo. And I got to really, and go into the book markets, get a sense of what was actually happening in the world of comics in the Middle East over the last bit of time. And it's one of those things I kept pulling the thread, and it went back further and further, all the way to 1920, which is really early in the world of comic art, of like sequential comic art. So the way I've kind of broken this down is into original comics on the bottom. So these were comics that were created by Arab artists with Arab editorial and publishers all throughout the last century plus. And then above, what I'm always kind of fixated on is those moments of cultural interaction where Western comics get translated into these same magazines and what happens there. I'll tell you that I used to read this very much like violence in the idea of in the 1960s, when you start having Superman and Batman, al-Watwat. I went too close on Watwat. Lulu, who I grew up thinking Lulu was an original Arab girl from my whole life. Tarzan, all these. That you started to it kind of supplemented, or it kind of eradicated the original Arab publications, which were a lot more kind of prolific before that time. And this kind of leads me to the two questions that I'll be teasing throughout this. These are less literal. What is the damage of smuggling Western ideas into Arab bodies? And is there a way to hijack those Western bodies for Arab ideas? Lots of quotes everywhere. We'll kind of break down some of these. But these are the things that I think about that really excite me. So I'm hoping that we could kind of unpack some of those today. And we'll do it by looking at Tintin. So what do I mean by Western ideas? We're going to kind of look at how Hergé imagined the Middle East for a little bit, and then we'll look at how those same ideas got translated back into Arabic. And we'll look at 4 distinct kind of comic strips and what those tell us about the publishing world of Arab comics. So this pretty much captures it, right? Like the idea of Western ideas being confronted. It's Tintin discovering Edward Said. So Tintin, Hergé, who was a Belgian artist, he was one of you could say a lot about him, but he was really one of the forefathers of children's comics and comic books as a medium that we know today. And Hergé came up with Tintin in the 1920s, so right around that time that, the original Al-Awlad and those Arab comics were starting. And Tintin is a boy reporter, and he travels around the world solving crimes with his dog Snowy and his good friend, Captain Haddock, who's I don't know, more than friends in my mind. And more than anywhere else in the entire run, Tintin's gone to the moon. He went to the moon before any space agents, before any space explorations actually did, and before Blue Origin. So Tintin went to the Middle East more than anywhere else in the comics. He went to real places like Egypt and Morocco, and he went to the version of Agrabah of the Tintin comics, Hamed, which, as you can imagine, all these destinations are sandy in the world of Tintin, and they follow a lot of those tropes that we'll look at right now. It's really important to note that Hergé rarely left Belgium while he was drawing all these far-off lands he was sending Tintin to. And in fact, as Tintin was really popular and being translated, it's been translated to over 60 languages. It's one of the most popular, prolific comic. Anyone who's traveled throughout the world, you've seen Tintin out through Asia, through the Middle East, everywhere. He couldn't understand why people would find his comics so interesting, even though he was sending Tintin to these places. So that's something to keep in mind there in terms of how Hergé was constructing the character and imagining the world. So Hamed is that fictional Arab country that I told you about. Some people, based off of the descriptions, have actually mapped it in where it could live in the real world. And there's a flag that you kind of see in the comics. So Tintin, when he's traveling to the Middle East, for me, it really exemplifies this idea of Western ideas, or really Orientalism 101, as Said talks about it. You'll see Tintin often coming to the rescue there. You see the Arab men in the Tintin comics, they rarely have speaking lines. They're usually punchlines. They're always heavily dressed. They are scheming. They're violent. They're quickly angry. And this is, in the first few pages of that first time that Tintin goes to the Middle East, he's in Egypt. And here he is running to the rescue of a blonde white woman who's being whipped by these Arab men. And for me, it's like identical almost to the ideas of Orientalism in classic paintings that Edward Said talks about. Particularly, we need to save the white women from the Arab men, the way they, that they will sexualize them and degrade them. It's Western values need to come to the rescue. So for me, Tintin kind of jumping in is that embodiment of that classic Orientalism. Elsewhere, things like praying are kind of used as a mockery. Here we have one of the Thompson twins kicking a man who is praying in the desert and saying, "Oh my God, I mistook you for a mirage." And here you kind of have the most quintessential idea how Arabs get imagined. How did Hergé draw Arabs? Back to that first question I'm asking. Highly devoutful and then highly angry, ready to immediately jump to violence there. And even the speech bubbles kind of in that ornate, mosque. There are also women in the Middle East in Hergé's conception, and they are always in niqab or heavily dressed and kind of hidden. So here you have this classic trope that's been explored in many Western mediums, particularly film, of Tintin and Haddock in disguise, disguising themselves as Arab women, because Arab women and Muslim women in particular, are so anonymous that you can dress up as them and get away with things. So here you have this confrontation, and Haddock immediately saying, "Why can't you talk English like everyone else? You fancy dress Fatima. What do you want anyway?" So this is kind of this gives you this idea that very rarely are the Arab characters even speaking and given that agency in the comics, and oftentimes they are the punchline of a joke or inciting incidents from that perspective. And then one of the greatest things that you discover when you read Tintin as an Arab speaker or have basic understanding of the Arabic language is that he didn't bother to learn how to write Arabic. I challenge anyone to read what's in that third panel here. It's just squiggles. And that's kind of the point. You don't need to know what they're saying. It's all just this idea of angry squiggles. That's how Arabs talk. And that's kind of how they kind of think more broadly. Elsewhere, you again have the highly religious motif on the far left, "by the beard of the prophet," which is something me and my Arab friends say all the time when we're going into battle. So the squiggle Arabic is another great example of how you draw Arabs and how we're imagined. It doesn't really matter what we have to say because it's squiggly and angry. And finally, this is kind of what I call the case of the Arab henchman. So the things when I'd started my research in 2010 that were really well known were about Hergé's representation of Black characters, particularly using those really horrendous old tropes that you can kind of see on the left. And so Hergé, in his first, in the black and white versions of all the comics, drew anyone who was from Africa or a Black character in this highly characterized way. What I find really interesting is in 1959, it was the first time that Tintin was being translated to the United States. And because of our own segregation laws, they asked the publisher that was making it here, asked Hergé to get rid of any of the Black characters in the comics. And so what Hergé did at that time was replace these henchmen, the characters that don't speak, that are just doing violence on the characters as kids that we love, with Arab men. So for me, this is exactly the quintessential interchangeability of stereotypes and how it works in the Western imagination. You could just literally blot out and replace one. Obviously, we consider more of a racialized stereotype, but we don't really talk about Arabs in that same way. Am I bumming everyone out? We're good? You're like, I love Tintin. I'm like, I will ruin Tintin for you. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple strips and how Tintin was translated into Arabic over a couple different iterations and what happens in those. So now that we all understand kind of these Western ideas that I'm talking about and how Hamed and Arabs are conceived in the Tintin books, we'll look at how those were translated back into Arabic and the different contestations and the conversations that happen when that translation occurs. So we'll start with Tintin in America from 1934. This was the original black and white. This is one of the first Tintin adventures, and Hergé is writing in this newspaper sending Tintin to America. He's interacting with Chicago gang members. It's a good zany story. In there, you kind of see him. This was that early style before they were made into color, so you can kind of see that. And what's really interesting about this is in 1934, this was created, and in 1947, we have the first instance of a Tintin translation into Arabic. He's no longer called Tintin, he's called Hammam, and this is from the adventures of hero Hammam and the land of Uncle Sam. What do you see when you see this? Not only has his name changed, but he has a tarbouche now. His style of dress has changed just a little bit, slightly. And instead of the speech bubbles, we have the artist at the time, who we don't know, who is taking this and scanning it, drawing, kind of writing the stories underneath as you would in those early Arab pieces of literature. This is really fascinating for me because when I discovered this is one of the earliest translations of Tintin to another language. This was 12 years before Tintin was ever translated into English. So this was like really early, really on the cutting edge, and showed immediately the thirst of bringing Tintin into these regional comic cultures. The comic, I call them a comic magazine, but this was El Kut that was published in. You'll see a theme of the issues that I talk about today. They're mostly published in Egypt in this early era of the 20s through the 60s. A lot of the publishing happened in Cairo. This magazine was active for 2 years, and Hammam was one of the founding characters that we saw in the comics. We don't know the number of circulation it got to, but we know that it was released every Monday, and it was definitely geared towards children. In the pages of Kut, you'd find like little games like this, like Spot the Difference and science experiments and things like that. And really the main comic that was driving it was these translations of Tintin into Hammam that you'd see throughout the comics. So here's another example from elsewhere in the run and what it kind of looks like in that newspaper format and that tri-printed color that you'd got in the Kut world. Then I kind of couple this with, that was the first translation, and this was more or less the last translation. This was done in 1977, And this is the first time that Tintin was translated legally. So you kind of see a lot of the examples from the ones I'll show you now, were all kind of done without fully being sanctioned by Casterman and the Hergé estate. These were all kind of like, we're literally copying or tracing the Tintin comics, and then we're changing the speech bubbles by doing that. So this gives you an example of what it would look like today if you bought it in the Middle East. You buy the Arab language versions of the Tintin books. Okay, so that was strip number 1. Now we'll go to strip number 2. Strip number 2 is, I'm going to look at King Odokar's scepter. So this was originally, the original version of this was from 1947. And in 1960, we have this translation here. Again, it's somewhat similar. Tintin's like iconic bright coif is changed into more of this kind of side part, black hair. His shorts are shortened, and he has a different vibe, I'd say, overall. Would we agree? What is really interesting about where this was published, it's not kind of what happened in the translation, but more where it was published. This was published in the pages of Sindbad. And in the parlance of Arab comics, Sindbad is like the first major event, right? Like this is the first what we kind of think of as comics, the way that we think of them today. Sindbad is one of the first kind of milestone markers of what Arab comics are. So a little bit more about Sindbad. It was published again in Egypt by Dar el-Maruf. The years it was printed were from 1952 to 1960, and the circulation got up to 27,000 copies a week. The creative director is Hussein Bakar, which in this space some people might know, and I'll kind of spend a little bit more talking about Hussein Bakar, but he's a really fascinating guy. So what should stick out to you from there is, I told you that translation happened in 1960. So that translation of Tintin, that King Odokar's Scepter, that was in the last issue of Sindbad before it stopped publishing. So it was kind of what I'll call like a last-ditch effort to bring in readers, is starting to translate Western comics. But before that, Hussein Bakar, who is really renowned as a fine artist, also had this deep passion for comic books. And he really had a passion for telling uniquely Arab stories in more of an Arab way. And this is not just like me reading it, this is what his whole ethos was. So this is from one of the early issues of Sindbad. This magazine is printed in Cairo to be read by children of all Arab countries, from the Maghreb to Marrakesh, from America to Lebanon. So the ambitions that he had while launching Sindbad were really to create a global comic from the Middle East and really bring in Arab readers from across the world. And if that sounds pan-Arab to you, it is. Like, this was exactly that Nasser era that we'll kind of get into. Even in his fine art, Hussein Bakar was part of what a group that they call themselves in Egypt, the Post-Orientalists. And their aim was to essentially they were trained by the French often in their education style, but their aim was to use authentically Egyptian traditions in their art and kind of explore those through the mediums. So Hussein Bakar, if you watch, like, he's done this in his fine art paintings, he's done it in movies, and he does it to no surprise in Sindbad, the comic strip. Even the main character, Sindbad, is exactly the same model of Tintin. It's kind of taking the Sindbad from 1001 Nights and saying, let's kind of cartoonify him and make him more accessible for children. So he's a boy traveler. He's like Sindbad's a boy, so children can relate to him. And he travels around, and he has this small dog as well, just like Snowy. So it's this really interesting counterexample of using that uniquely Arab context and Ottoman context of the 1001 Nights and telling a different story based off of that source material than you'd get in a Western comic. And the covers, I think, are some of my favorite parts of the Sindbad world. You could kind of see here, you have a more traditional view of how to draw an Arab, but you also have these other articulations of how to draw an Arab, particularly in the era that was happening. This is like Bizarro Mad Men, right? These are like ideas of modern Arab living rooms that Bakar was really interested in showing on the covers. So you see here, just like, I think about this family a lot. Like the man in repose and the bright colors, the mom preparing the dinner, the kid playing with the dog. These are ideas of Arab domesticity that you would not see in Agrabah or in Hamed or in anywhere else in kind of the Western imagination at the same time. So I love this. Elsewhere here, it is kind of more this upper class bourgeois Arab aspirational of a young woman in repose reading. She's not in a full niqab, and like the kind of guy in the back working on the clock. That's happening there. You'd also have kind of these really fun stories that I don't know if we have a lot of comics readers here, but when you think about the Tintin, they're really rigid in those kind of boxes in that clear line style. But here you kind of have explorations of form. So the boxes are more fluid. It really feels more like translating Arabic into this art form in a unique way as opposed to kind of a more rigid way. So you can kind of see that throughout. The next example, our third strip of Tintin translation is when he became Tim. So this is a year after Sindbad, and as Sindbad was ending, another really landmark magazine was starting called Samir. And Samir was really able to take in the benefit of the Nasser era. I'll talk about a little bit more of like what he was trying to accomplish with his pan-Arab ideas. This is the first time that readers of Samir magazine, pretty early into its run, were introduced to Tintin. Again, these were done illegally, so they weren't kind of sanctioned by the Hergé state and Casterman. But we see that unlike Hammam, it's very much taking Tintin one-to-one, changing his name to Tim. And a lot of that is like kind of the change happens in the dialogue of these and the colors used. I find this really symbolic in the magazine article I wrote, which I'm basing this talk off of. I really think of it as like really symbolic that he's welcoming in spring to the pages of the comics. It's the idea that Tintin is here to save you, or Tim's here to save you, bring you to a brighter pasture. He's literally wheat posting over the kind of desolate gray and saying springtime is coming, Tim is coming. So these were the announcements of Tim before he arrived. Samir magazine, fascinating. This is by far my favorite of the comic magazines of the time. The publisher was Dar el-Hilal, also in Egypt. The years active were from 1956 to 2008, so it really ran for a really long time, really prominent, and each decade of Samir is amazing. All of your favorite Arab artists have probably worked in the pages. It was a really good, steady gig for people, particularly those in the comic art form. Circulation, we just said 27,000 for Sindbad, 80,000 at its peak. The reason why is, as I was saying, kind of that Nasser era was issued in, and Nasser saw a real value in using the pages of these comics to explore Arab ideas of how we're all united as Arabs, and had that pan-Arab agenda. So after the Egyptian-Syrian Union, all of a sudden, Samir is available in literally every Arab country. So it's being circulated. It really has that view. And again, it has a strong point of view of what it means to be Arab in the pages. Just like Hussein Bakar was the main creative force behind Sindbad, for Samir, you have Nadia Nishat. Nadia Nishat always really had this idea of the magazine, and when she pitched it to the publisher, of it being for Arabs, and really you could see that from the ethos of the start of the magazine, where she said, we wanted children to be involved in naming the magazine and naming the character. This is also one of my favorite illustrations. It's on the first. It's the first 100-year. It's the 100 issue celebration of the Samir magazine, the anniversary edition, and you can actually see the staff of Arabs who actually brought together Samir magazine, who were the publishers, the drawers, and everything. And you see Nadia Nishat here kind of feeding the children and making sure they're getting their comics. So these were really buoyed and boosted by the Nasser government directly. So there was the publication, all the publishers, as they kind of became more state-sponsored, he saw a lot of value in making sure that these were supported, that were available to kids as they got out of school. So Samir was really a phenomenon through that lens. When we think about the comic characters of Samir magazine, before Tintin, or kind of at the same time as Tintin, there were original Arab characters, just like Sindbad. So this is the titular character Samir. There's millions of examples like this through the pages of these, essentially, usually the protagonists are other Arab children getting into trouble, getting into mischief, solving, getting into scrapes. Like was the bread and butter of the original comic characters in the Samir universe. And then, you start having Tintin join them. So here you have like Samir, and you also have Tintin. So Tintin starts initially getting very integrated as one of these other characters in the universe of the Samir magazines. When Tintin starts entering the pages, you can immediately see that the coloration looks really different. So there was a lot of liberties taken for the colors. Like I said, the name, but most of the art stayed the same from Hergé. This is one of my favorite. When I discovered it in Cairo, I remember just like losing my mind because the colors are so crazy. It's like an acid trip of Tintin in the desert, and it just is really compelling. Like, it's just fun to see Tintin remixed in this way as he becomes Tintin in the covers and within the magazines. So it's usually kind of a two-page spread that you'd find in the magazines there. Then eventually he starts kind of running the show a little bit more and taking over. So instead of just being a bubble, you start having some like him on the cover of these Samir magazines. Now, this is an interesting one because, when I was bringing those questions up earlier after how to draw an Arab, it's can you kind of hijack these Western bodies for Arab ideas? And what I mean by Arab ideas is really the Nasserist pan-Arab ideas that were in these comics that now Tintin is kind of co-signing, if you will. So while you have Tintin on some, this is Nasser, right? Like on another magazine. So from week to week, you kind of get these merging and cultural, where the cultures are just kind of falling into each other of Tintin and Nasser and the ideas underneath it. So I go back to this idea, is there a way to hijack Western bodies like Tintin with Arab ideas like Nasserism? To give you a better sense of kind of what was happening on the non-Tintin pages, gives you a really good view of Nasserism in a nutshell of like, we are all connected as Arab countries, we're on the same train, we need to be united more holistically. Elsewhere, when you wouldn't have Tintin, you'd have young Egyptians often enlisting and going into service and serving their country there. One of my favorite characters in the Samir universe is Zakiya. Any Zakiya fans in the house? No, okay. No one knows Zakiya? Zakiya's the coolest. So Zakiya is this brilliant little girl, and the comic books that feature her are usually her teaching her classmates about Arab history and other moments within it. And it's kind of like she's a smart aleck. She always has her glasses, and she's kind of pushing them up, as you could kind of see there. In this Zakiya comic from the Samir, sorry? Oh.
I know an older lady in Lebanon, her name is Zakiya.
Oh yeah, she must be smart.
Yeah.
So here in this particular comic, this gives you an example of something you'd never see in Western comics. Zakiya is welcoming a student from Palestine into the class who's had to become a refugee because of the Israeli massacre in 1953. So you actually have children who are picking up this magazine, getting this representation and this education into Arab history in a way that you would never really see in Tintin. Like, this is like a very different articulation, and we feel sympathy and empathy for the young girl in the Zakiya comics, and she's welcomed in this pan-Arab concept. Elsewhere, you have celebrations of religious holidays in Samir, but also really that military motif as well. So there again. So this is, it's different. Like, as a Western comic book reader, it feels subversive and wrong to see kids going to war. And here it's like literally using the tools of the classroom to go to war. It's really fascinating, and it shows the different Arab reality that we live with, that these artists, those same publishers and the people I showed you earlier, were getting into the pages. Now, hijacking Western bodies. What is the most Western body you could think of? It's the most ubiquitous one. It's actually not Tintin, it's Mickey Mouse. So why I love these Samir magazines is you literally had the hijacking of Mickey Mouse happen within these pages. So Mickey became Mickey, or Mickey Mouse became Mickey. He had his own spin-off magazine, which this is from, but he started in the Samir. And here you literally have Mickey Mouse leading you back to Palestine, kind of like, let's march back. Elsewhere, you have Mickey going to war, even with toy guns, but it's kind of the militarization of the Mickey Mouse, particularly in the Arab-Israeli war. And it's always kind of fun and kooky, but it's definitely not sanctioned by Disney. And perhaps the best articulation is Mickey Mouse literally carrying the Egyptian flag into battle with kind of collaged military men behind him. So this is kind of when I'm saying hijack Western bodies with Arab ideas. What is this Mickey Mouse? What is the Tintin that's in these pages? Is he the same Tintin that we're reading here in America? How is he different? Or how is it the same kind of in Trojan horsing Western ideas? The last one I'll leave you with before Tala and I start talking to each other is back to the squiggles. So if you remember, a few minutes ago I was telling you about how Hergé didn't bother to learn Arabic, and the way he would often have the Arab characters presented, they were kind of quick to violence, saying things like "by the beard of the prophet" or squiggling. So the Arab translators who had to then take these comics had to think about what would go into those speech bubbles. And this for me is exactly the moment where cultures and imperialism can be challenged, is in translating in these small decisions that the editors had to make when thinking about how to represent Tintin to the Arab audience. So here's one example from Samir. By the beard of the prophet is changed to "this time I have to hit you." And the kind of squiggles are given new meanings. So, you kind of go from this and you get the same idea. I must get revenge on him, I must. In these small things that are done, you immediately feel, for me at least, as reading it, it's very small, but that character has more agency. It's a more real person. In just those two speech bubbles, the way that it's translated, for me, feel like that moment of resistance. Here's another example. This is from those ones that were done legally. So Casterman had to know that these changes were happening in that process. And here it's translated a little differently. "You won't escape. I'll get you this time. This will be the last shot." And this will be the last shot. This is the end of my talk. I am really interested in how this character, this kind of sideways character who was not even given real vocabulary in the context of the comic, had to then become a real person in the translation to Arabic. And that for me is kind of how you start answering that question of how you draw an Arab. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate, oh, sorry. Again, I appreciate you coming out on a Sunday to hear about Tintin.